Our scripture reading today comes from Mark chapter 6, verses 30 through 44. The apostles gathered around Jesus and told him all that they had done and taught. He said to them, "Come away to a deserted place all by yourselves and rest a while." For many were coming and going, and they had no leisure even to eat. And they went away in the boat to a deserted place by themselves. Now many saw them going and recognized them, and they hurried there on foot from all the towns and arrived ahead of them. As he went ashore, he saw the great crowd, and he had compassion for them, because they were like sheep without a shepherd. And he began to teach them many things. When it grew late, his disciples came to him and said, "This is a deserted place, and the hour is now very late. Send them away so that they may go into the surrounding country and villages and buy something for themselves to eat." But he answered them, "You give them something to eat." And they said to him, "Are we going to go and buy 200 denarii worth of bread and give it to them to eat?" And he said to them, "How many loaves have you? Go and see." When they had found out, they said, 5 and 2 fish. Then he ordered them to get all the people to sit down in groups on the green grass. So they sat down in groups of hundreds and of 50s. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and blessed and broke the loaves and gave them to his disciples to set before the people. And he divided the 2 fish amongst them all. And all ate, and all were filled. And they took up 12 baskets full of broken pieces and of the fish. Those who had eaten the loaves numbered 5,000 men.
Well, it was hot and humid by the lake. Everybody thinks about the Near East as this desert, but there on Lake Kinneret, aka the Sea of Galilee, humidity is heavy. Jesus had been speaking to crowds and was beginning to feel the exhaustion. Everybody wanting a piece of him. He was tired, and he didn't know if he had more to give. So he and the disciples stole away to a place where he thought they could escape for a while. But, as we heard, before long, the crowd sought him out. They were searching for him. They wanted his guidance, his word, his hope, his wisdom. They just wanted time with him. So he took compassion on them, and he gathered them together, and he began to preach and teach once more. But soon it got late, and they were far from a village, so the disciples wisely nudged Jesus to let them disperse, there being nothing to eat and no easy way to acquire anything. The disciples themselves were hungry. They were tired. They'd been looking forward to the escape. The crowd must also be hungry too. So they thought the kindest thing for them to do would be to send the people away so they could get some food for themselves. Makes sense, of course, right? Wrap it up, Jesus. Time's up. Go on. Get them home. They can get on with their lives. But at the suggestion of sending them away to find food, Jesus stopped the disciples. Wait. You give them something to eat. Jesus? Maybe he wasn't thinking clearly. Lack of food had already gotten to him. Are you you crazy? We don't have food. You want us to feed them? We got nothing here. It's not like they had a refrigerator full of food and they stared into a packed fridge, as so many of us do, then sighed and said, there's nothing to eat. No, in this case, there really wasn't anything to eat. Are you kidding me, Jesus? A question I imagine the disciples asked all throughout Jesus' ministry. We don't have any food. How are we supposed to feed all these people? There's like 5,000 of them. That's not even including the women and children. You know that was 5,000 men, right? They didn't come alone. Feed them? I don't think so. We've got nothing here, just 5 loaves, 2 fish. Tell you the truth, I don't even think there's enough for us, let alone everybody else. Jesus shouldn't be responsible for their needs. And obviously, neither should the disciples. After all, they didn't even call this gathering. They hadn't anticipated it. It wasn't a part of the tour. Truth be told, all they wanted was a chance to get away. But these people followed them. And then Jesus gave them what they wanted. And that should have been enough. But according to Jesus, it wasn't. This directive, this mandate just seemed impossible. Laughable. And how could they? They had nothing. Looking at the crowd, it didn't take long to guess the cost of the food that would be far beyond their means. 200 denarii, that's estimated about 8 months of work. Can you imagine that? They didn't have that kind of money. And if they did, would they actually give it all away to be consumed before their very eyes? But Jesus doesn't let them off the hook. Not this time. Up until this point, the disciples have enjoyed listening to Jesus, watching him teach and preach, witnessing him cast out demons, heal the sick. It was exciting to see him confound the Pharisees with his parables and his one-liners. It felt good to be one of the inner circle. Now, they didn't always get it, because remember, this is the Gospel of Mark. The disciples never get it. But they love to watch Jesus do it. Jesus responds to the disciples and their desire for him to fix everything, to put on another show by pushing back. He wasn't satisfied with their answers. The money argument wasn't going to work. The lack of food wouldn't deter him. You give them something to eat. And he had faith that they could do it. That if they searched, if they opened their minds, they would find an answer and they'd be able to feed these 5,000 men and all the children and women that came with them. Figure it out. Give them something to eat. As Daniel Deffenbaugh writes, it's as though Jesus says, "Show's over, boys. Now you need to get to work." Now, as Jesus began to contemplate the future, his destiny in Jerusalem, this need to perpetuate the vision, he was asking for something new, something more. It was time for the disciples to become apostles, for these listeners of the word to become doers of the word. But are they ready? They feel completely helpless. Jesus isn't helping them. They feel a little hopeless. He put it all on them. They're just standing there with these 5 loaves and these 2 fish going, what? What are we going to do with this? It's not enough, they say. And we agree. There's just not enough. There's not enough for everyone. Besides, why is it our problem, our responsibility? Because Jesus said so? Don't you get it? We can't be responsible for everyone else. What about independence? What about personal accountability? What about going out and taking care of business? Aren't there straps on those sandals? Pull yourselves up. We can't do it. And then he says it again. You get them something to eat. He's calm. He's secure in his words. There are no apologies, no explanations, no allowances given, monetary or otherwise. He just tells the disciples, do it. And so they brought him what they had. And he blessed it. And he broke it. And lo and behold, there was enough for everybody with leftovers. Come on, you say. Can we possibly take this seriously? I mean, this isn't meant for us today, right? This was an old story. That was some miracle. But Jesus' miracles are limited to the pages of the dusty old book. He isn't really talking to us, right? Right? Now, I want to let you know that this story was a really popular one. In fact, the author of Mark decides to tell it twice. His doublet emphasizes just how popular this story was. He probably heard two different versions of it from maybe two different communities, and then he decided to include it twice when he wrote his gospel. But he's not the only one who thinks this is a story worth telling. Both the authors of Matthew and Luke read it in Mark and agree, this really is a good one, got to put it in. Let's tell it too. And it even occurs in the fourth gospel, in John, which we believe is independent from the first three synoptic gospels. So this means that this story had weight. It was authenticated by multiple sources. It was really popular. It was maybe even true. True. Now, true is a tricky word. In this case, though, there might be some actual historicity to it. And in general, I think Bible stories are true in that they have truth in them, even if they are not historically accurate. But I just can't help but think that all of these verses, there must be some part of this story that actually happened. And so if there is enough truth in this story for all four canonical gospel writers to tell it, then there might also be at least a little bit of truth for you and me today. Well, look, it isn't hard to see the connection to the Eucharist, to communion. Jesus breaks the bread. Jesus feeds us all. There's something so incredibly powerful about the act of breaking bread. It's like the story of the manna that fell from heaven when Moses and the Israelites wandered and hungered and wondered, would there be enough? Jesus breaks the bread, and 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 there's always enough. And then there's more than enough, the story says. Somehow, in the blessing and the breaking, there's enough food for everyone. Now, I have to admit that sometimes I'm worried when I'm standing before you. The communion bread is pre-cut, and it's awaiting the blessing of the ritual of taking communion. And I wonder the same thing. Will there be enough? Will we need to rush and get more? I mean, I think it was just last month, wasn't it, deacons? And they were running around in the back, and we diverted one line to the other station, and I was so worried, is this the day? It's a good thing to happen. We have so many people, we're running out of bread, but I was still really worried. What if you didn't get your blessing? And somehow, there was enough. So that hot day by the lake, the disciples worried as I would have worried. It was easy for Jesus to make grand gestures. He wasn't the one who held the purse and counted the money. He didn't seem to have a concept of how much this food would cost. He didn't even seem to care about that stuff. Now, had I been there, I would have been wringing my hands, and I would have inwardly blamed Jesus for not being responsible. I probably would have resented him, as some of the disciples seem to, when he flippantly commands without rational awareness of what he's asking. I maybe would have even blamed all the people. Like, why'd they show up anyways? Don't you bring food with you if you're going to be gone long distances? But there's no excuses. Not enough food, not enough money, no place to buy it. No, there's hungry people. Give them something to eat. And while we'd very much like this to be a story about those disciples, especially the dumb ones in Mark, because we're so much more evolved 2,000 years later, Jesus was talking to his disciples. There's a timeless truth in this story. Jesus is talking to his disciples. There are hungry people. And they are right here in our community. There are hungry people the world over, and it is overwhelming. I think I'm like many of us. I can suffer from compassion fatigue. I don't know what to do. I can barely process it all. I very much feel the anxiety of everything wrong in the world and the helplessness of not knowing what to do. I end up just like those disciples, frustrated and at a loss. What can I possibly do to help the situation? I don't have the resources, and I barely have the will. How am I supposed to feed all the people? How am I supposed to clothe these people? How are we supposed to save these people? It's so much easier to say it's not my problem. But then there's Jesus. Make your miracle, Jesus. Right now. We need it. It's as good a time as any. We couldn't need your help more. Help us. I don't know if you can hear him, but it sounds something like, you give them something to eat. Well, it's World Communion Sunday, and the bread of the world before us, and it fills our communion table, but we know that it's not enough to feed 5,000 people, let alone hundreds of thousands, millions of people. But Jesus doesn't want us to focus on the scarcity, the powerlessness, the excuses. He says, take whatever you got. What do you got? Bring it to me. Take what you got. Of course, experts tell us that there's enough food, even though we have global food deprivation. There's enough substantial food to feed the masses. It's because some people have more than others. And we're the sum. So take what you got. I don't have all the answers. I do not pretend to. And sometimes it's hard to imagine how a man who lived 2,000 years ago in a world and a society that is so different from our world and our society. It's almost silly to think he could have all the answers for us now. But maybe he does. Innate in this story is the miracle of Jesus' ability to sustain when nothing else can. And I think it's also the miracle of what happens when people come together to tap into their own resources and give of themselves. And so when we are faced with problems that seem too big to answer, too big to even address, may we find our direction from Jesus and from God. We may find our sustenance from God, from this bread of life that sustains us. With a God who makes a way out of no way, not by coming up with easy answers, but by leading us through the shadow of the darkest valley, who takes our doubt and walks alongside us, who offers us Jesus to not only be a model, but a brother, to show us how to be in this world, to tap into our very divinity, to give of ourselves and make miracles happen. There is enough. We are enough. The people of the world are hungry. Give them something to eat. Amen. And so it is that we